Okay, it's good to be back. We're continuing in our training of understanding and dealing with, really, guilt, shame, and fear in the life of a Christian and in the life of the church for that matter. Yesterday, we spent some time defining guilt, shame, and fear. And in our definitions, we uncovered a couple of important concepts. One, that guilt is a relational word inasmuch as it tends to have us still thinking, how can I make it right with the person that I've sinned against, right? I'm still looking for forgiveness, and in that regard, there's a relationship still present. But when we move to shame and fear, those are two anti-relational things. Shame because we cover ourselves, and thereby we cannot have a relationship, and fear because we hide ourselves, and again, it prevents genuine relationship. In guilt, we're really asking, forgive me. In shame, accept me. And in fear, love me. But sometimes we get confused that that's what's really needed, right? And so we seek other things. And we then turned our attention to what I call unhealthy or maybe unhelpful attitudes. We looked at guilt and the tendency we have to try to justify ourselves. We talked about adding the word but at the end of an apology. I'm sorry I hit you in the face, but I was upset about the football game. I'm sorry I did this, but, and that whenever the word but is there, it means we're seeking self-justification rather than genuine forgiveness and reconciliation. And that most apologies by people who claim they've apologized are not true apologies because of the presence of that word. It can even be because. I was angry with you because, therefore it was okay that I screamed at you. We're not really apologizing, we're justified. When it comes to shame, it's almost like we think we can sanctify ourselves and we can somehow deal with this inner condition. We desire to be admired, to be thought better than we really are. We try to cover our shame by honoring ourselves. And we talked about the fact that you can't honor yourself, you must be honored by others. And obviously the true core of solving guilt and shame is forgiveness by God and others, and shame being honored by God and others. And then we looked at fear. I must not fail. I must glorify myself. I'm going to prove that I'm greater than my fear. And we even talked about some people who take risk-taking to new heights in some sort of weird thing of proving that they're not afraid. But the desire to control, the desire to always be in charge, the desire to make the outcome become what I want it, so often grows out of fear. And then we talked about how those things operate in the church and how sometimes the busiest, most active, even most prayerful people are sometimes being motivated not by grace or the love of God, but often maybe by some guilt that's been unresolved, some shame that's unresolved, or fear that has not been dealt with. And we particularly mentioned how crucial it is that the leadership of the church deal with these three things deeply amongst themselves, and that rarely happens. And so even in leadership, we have meetings to discuss important matters, and what's really happening is that our guilt, our shame, our fear is operating under the surface, preventing genuine relationship with God and each other, and thereby preventing the Holy Spirit from leading us to a healthy place with regard to the congregation. Does that all make sense to you?
Yes.
This is very common, and we all do it, right? We all know that we do it.
Yes.
All right. So today, I want to move to the next section, which is, what are the basic reasons we experience guilt, shame, and fear in a broad sense? Here's the first reason. Due to our own sin, our own rebellion against God. Now that seems obvious. Sometimes it's just our fault, right? We did it. We have to own the reality of our guilt. We have to face our shame, our fear. It's just us, right? Psalm 51, 3 and 4, David says, "For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Against you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. Say, I did it. Right? There's no Bathsheba here. Yes, what's up?
You kept the key.
Oh,
You did it.
I did it. I kept the key. We need our room cleaned, eh? Now, it's our sin before God, right? This is crucial. And David recognized that when it came to confessing his sin. Psalm 51 was written after his sin with Bathsheba and against Uriah. And he said, no. Ultimately, at the core, I did this against you, God, right? Because Bathsheba and Uriah are yours. Number 2, sometimes it's due to our own sin, not before God, but before the world. Here's an example, right? John 8, 3 through 5. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, Teacher, this woman is caught in the act of adultery, and the law of Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say? Sometimes our sin is absolutely open to the community. See, David had to be exposed, right? His sin was in secret before the Lord. Now here's an example of a woman whose sin was before the community, before the world. Now, we all know the difference, right, in our own life. Sometimes there are things we've done that no one knows about, but we know about, and God knows about. Sometimes there are things we have done that the world knows about because they were done publicly, or we've been found out by the world. Do you see what I mean? And there's a difference with those. But they're both a problem. Number 3, sometimes we're dealing with guilt, shame, and fear due to the sins of others, or before our own weaknesses before God. Hebrews 4, 15 and 16. We don't have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses. We have one who has been tempted in every way as we are, yet he didn't sin. Right? So let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Sometimes we have a weakness issue, right? Sometimes we are struggling with others, and we have this weakness issue. You'll hear this a lot with people who are dealing with what the old pastors used to call besetting sins. Not something I did once, but something I keep doing and don't seem to have any ability to master, right? They call it a besetting sin. You say, well, I just keep having a problem with my anger. Over and over, I find myself losing control. And it doesn't matter how much I pray, right? It just keeps coming back. There's something weak in me in this area. Another Christian thinks, well, I don't have any problem with anger. Yes, but what is your weakness, right? Maybe it's lust sexually, or maybe it's a fear about money issues, or maybe it's a tendency to think too highly of yourself. There's always weakness in us, and sometimes that weakness can become a source of guilt, shame, or fear. Sometimes it's due to the sin of others or from our own weakness before the world. It's not just a private thing that God knows, right? Here's an example, John chapter 9, verse 1. As Jesus went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, right? Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? See, the world is looking at this blind man, and this issue of the blind man's weakness now becomes a question about sin. Why is this blind man, say, in a shameful condition? Why? Because it's before the world, and the world is calling it down on him. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Can I make a point?
Sure.
About that scripture?
Yeah.
That would be an example too of that we could have guilt, shame, or fear just because we live in a fallen world. In other words, our guilt, shame, or fear could be false, but it's there because we feel that our weakness is a sin, when maybe it isn't even a sin.
It's a weakness.
it's not a sin of anybody's. There are people that are born with disabilities, and we live in a fallen world. We're not in heaven yet. Things aren't perfect.
That's right.
So there's suffering that doesn't have a source at all in anyone's sin.
Yes, and the guilt. What we're saying is the guilt, shame, and fear can come from our sin against God that nobody knows about, our sin against God that everybody knows about or some know about, or from weaknesses in us that no one knows about, or weaknesses that others know about. Right? The sources of guilt, shame, and fear. What I'm trying to say is, there's plenty of room for all of us to deal with these things.
Yes.
Because even if we are comfortable with a weakness we have, then others attempt to shame us. I'll give you an example. We have a friend named Juanita Howard. Juanita's probably 70 years old now. She was born with cerebral palsy. In other words, she was deprived of oxygen during the birth process. It had a tremendous effect on her body. She's spastic. Do you know what I mean? Her motions are like this. And when she talks like this. Intellectually, had no effect. She has her master's degree. She was a vocational counselor for the handicapped. She was on the governor of North Carolina's board for the handicapped. But I can tell you that Christians throughout her life have attempted to shame her because she, quote, wasn't healed. Why aren't you healed, Juanita? Do you not have enough faith, Juanita?
Pray for you, different.
Wanted to pray. Some years ago, we were chatting with her, and she was telling us about a wonderful church she'd become deeply involved with. And we asked this question: what is it about this church that's been different from all the other churches? Because she'd gone through several churches. She said, this is the first church that has not tried to heal me. She said, I settled the issue of my cerebral palsy with Jesus when I was 14 years old. And he said to me, I will not heal you. I'm going to glorify myself through your weakness. I have been telling Christians that for 50 years, and this is the first group of Christians who's taken my word for it and are simply treating me as a normal member of the church, not as someone who's an object of their pity. You see, the world can seek to shame us, to impose on our weakness that which isn't valid. It doesn't mean we don't feel shame. Just because it isn't valid doesn't mean we don't struggle with it, that we don't feel afraid, that we don't feel guilt, that we don't experience those things. Does that make sense? We have to acknowledge, and all of this means that guilt, shame, and fear are the normal experience of a human being, even Christians. And that if we don't let Jesus deal with us at the deepest level in these areas, then our lives will be lived out of these rather than out of the grace that Abby talked about and we discussed in being, becoming, and doing. Instead of flowing out of this deep acceptance of God, of us in Christ, instead of flowing out of a deep awareness of how loved we are, instead of flowing out of a deep gratitude of being forgiven, a great awareness that our weakness and our failure is not what defines us, but rather that we're part of God's family. Instead of being afraid, we're aware that God loves us, that there's nothing that can separate us from Him, you see. We end up living under the thumb, under the tyranny of guilt, shame, and fear. One, two, or all of them, or a combination. And in the church, because we don't deal with these things directly, I can tell you, and I think anybody who's ministered in the church for longer than 10 years can tell you, these things are controlling families, they're destroying churches, they're causing all sorts of trouble. You mentioned the false prophets running here and there. I can tell you right now that every false prophet is being controlled by one or more of these things, not by the grace of God. Every time. And I would bet shame is a deep part of it, especially these young boys. Maybe they grow up as an orphan. Maybe their mother didn't get married. Who knows? Who knows what's going on? But the point is, we have to deal with these. Now, what contributes to us having what I'd call, in terms of how we deal with these things? And I want to take a look at several things, at our families, at our culture, at religion in general, not just Christianity. And I want to look at those three things because they are the three dominant contributors to how we look at and deal with guilt, shame, and fear. And I want to begin with our family. And I want to begin with guilt. And I'm going to say something to you that I think is going to shock you. The key years for us coming to an understanding of guilt, shame, and fear from our families, well, you tell me, what age? If you were going to choose 3 years out of the development of a child to adulthood, what 3 years would be the crucial years for that child beginning to think through guilt, shame, and fear and beginning to think about it in a certain way? How old? How old? From 3 years on. Another idea? Older? Are we all comfortable with 3 years and on?
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what the answer is?
Yeah.
The 18-month period between 18 months old and 3 years old is the crucial period.
18 months.
18 months. The family's view of guilt, shame, and fear, the DNA of the family becomes imprinted on the 1.5-year-old child.
From then to age 3.
3. By the time the child turns 4, it's done. You say, what are you talking about? I'm telling you that when somebody has a certain view of these things, it began then, not when they were 12, not when they went off to college, no. When they were just learning to talk. They were just saying dada mama. The DNA of the family on guilt, shame, and fear was being imprinted in their soul, in their mind. Let that sit with you for a second. Then ask yourself, what about the 80-year-old woman in my congregation who always sits on the back row and never speaks at a church meeting? And yet when you speak with her privately, you find out she's deeply mature in Christ. What's going on there? Well, it started when she was 18 months. Let's talk about guilt.
Oh yeah.
There's healthy guilt, hear me out, and unhealthy approaches to guilt. Healthy approaches and unhealthy. In a family, if the family has a healthy attitude about guilt, it'll be like this. Guilt is understood to be appropriate moral guilt. People aren't held being guilty by how they look, which they have no control over. This is why white supremacy is such a lie. You're guilty because you're white. Wow, how could I didn't make myself white. Appropriate moral guilt says, no, the guilt is attached to what you do, not to what you look like or your personality. Are you with me? Because remember, personality is fully shaped by the age of 5. It has to do with appropriate regret for wrong actions or not doing what we should have done, right? Commission or omission. And it has to do with the desire to make things right as much as possible. So in a healthy family situation with guilt, people are not made to feel guilty or called guilty for who they are or how they look, but only for what they do or don't do. And they're taught regret, which leads to try to make it right. In other words, the regret is relational. We want the child to grow up going, well, when I make a mistake, I move towards the person I harmed, not away from the person I harmed.
So when I hit my brother,
The The solution is to move towards and seek forgiveness, not to withdraw, right? Which is now moving into fear or shame. Are you with me? That's healthy. But unhealthy families they specialize in inappropriate guilt or imagined guilt. But families do this a lot. They blame children who actually didn't do anything. They, for example, if I didn't have such a lazy son, I'd probably be a more successful businessman. You see what we've just done to the son?
Mm.
That's inappropriate and imagined. Families do this all the time.
Or a child looks like someone
Yes.
that left us.
You
A spouse.
a mother whose husband leaves hates the firstborn son whose face reminds her, and so you're just like your father.
Mm.
You're guilty by association.
Mm.
Doesn't this happen in families? Yes. Mom, I didn't do it. I don't care whether you did it or not. I'm going to punish you. Somebody has to pay for this. Yes. And the child learns. Doesn't matter whether I'm guilty or not guilty. I suffer. It's inappropriate. In fact, that's immoral, that behavior, that treatment. So in a family, and most families have a mix of healthy and unhealthy. And our hope as Christian families is to have the healthy dominate the unhealthy. And when we do it, when we express unhealthy, we seek the forgiveness of the child. I'm sorry, Daddy shouldn't have yelled at you because you dropped the glass of milk. You're 18 months old. You're not guilty. You're just 18 months. Please forgive Daddy. Are you with me? Yes.
Doug, can I say something?
Sure.
That's why if there is conflict a lot
Yes.
in a home between adults,
Yes.
little children can feel guilty
That's right.
because they're caught.
Between.
Maybe that child is having fun with one and the other one's angry at that adult, so they lash out
Sure.
at the adult and the child.
Yes.
And the child feels it's their fault.
Exactly. This can also happen with imagined guilt. They call it survivor's guilt, where the person who doesn't die in the car crash feels guilty that they live. That's false guilt. It's not real guilt. They're not guilty before God for living through a car crash, but they feel it. And if the family's not careful, they will literally assign guilt to the one who survived. A parent could say this to a son: I wish it was your brother who had survived and not you. Ah. Why did your sister have to be eaten by the crocodile? Why couldn't I have sent you that day? Are you with me? This is all real. Healthy and unhealthy. How about shame? Haha. Right? A healthy family approach to shame is to teach that we want to avoid thoughts, words, and deeds, right, that will lead us to appropriate regret. In other words, the purpose of healthy shame is to cause us to pause and go, if I engage in that behavior or I don't do that thing, I'm going to later regret that I did or didn't do it in a healthy way. Therefore, I'm not going to take that action. There's nothing wrong with that. That's healthy shame. In other words, if I decide to punch you in the nose, Martin, in the long run, that's going to damage our relationship. So if I feel a sense of shame that crossed my mind, if it stops me from punching you, no problem. But unhealthy shame, well, that's when family secrets are buried. Right? If there's physical, verbal, or emotional trauma or abuse in a household, but everyone's taught that no one must ever find that out outside the household, If betrayal has happened and the family refuses to deal with the betrayal and allow there to be resolution and healing, instead teaches that you cover the betrayal, you must not let anyone know what you did. Cover, cover, cover. Our family, this is our family business. This has nothing to do with the clan or even certainly not the village. Keep this within the hut.
They even say you are being selfish
Yes.
for exposing this because you're forgetting about the other people.
See that? See that? Yeah. And as we're going to see later, one of the secrets to dealing with shame is exposure. But if you're taught not to expose, then when you're older, anytime you experience shame, you're covering, and thereby the thing that would heal can't happen. It's sort of like somebody would say to you, you go to the doctor because you have a large boil on your leg, eh? And the doctor says, you don't want anybody to see that or they won't want to be with you. We're going to bandage it. Just keep it covered. No. What does the doctor say? We have to, what? Open it and leave it exposed to the sun
For the air.
so that healing can occur. Well, but see, we use shame in families to cover. Better to be covered and sick than uncovered and sick, right? We don't want anyone to know. Yes, Abby?
So in a family with a little child, think about how we teach them about privacy,
That's right.
about nakedness.
Yes.
We teach them, oh, you're not going to go to church without any clothes on
Yes.
because it's not appropriate. And
That's
that's
right.
healthy,
That's
right?
right. That's right.
We say, okay, let's cover up.
Yes.
But if we say to them, they're 18 months or 2 years old, and they wet themselves,
Yes.
and if we react with horror and shock, how could you do that? That's just being an 18-month-old or a 2-year-old.
That's exactly right.
They haven't learned. So we have to be careful
Yes.
to not shame them
That's
in a
right.
bad way about just normal things.
Right. Right.
If they drop their pants, we don't have a big fit about it because they're so little. We just teach them, no, let's keep your pants up. We'll
Yes.
go over here or behind this tree and you can do what you need to do.
I'm going to tell a funny story. If you have to edit it out for cultural reasons, I'll leave that to you, nothing. So we have friends who had a grandson who was 18 months old, who got into the habit of sitting around rubbing himself with a big smile on his face. 18 months old. Our friend Bill says, he goes up to grandfather and he says, now young man, we want you to stop doing that. It's not appropriate, right? To rub yourself there. And the boy says, he couldn't say the letter R yet. He says, but it's my penis. I love it. It's my penis. I love my penis. I want to rub it. All right. I said, Bill, what did you do? Healthy? I said to him, your penis is fine. We just won't want you to rub it when you're with other people. Healthy. He did to say, your penis is a weapon. You must keep it in its sheath.
It's evil.
It's an evil thing. You're a naughty, naughty boy. You should be ashamed of yourself for touching yourself in public. You see? And I said to my friend, good for you. And of course, within a few months, he stopped doing it because he was growing and it was just he's a little kid. But shame can be used. It can destroy them. And then later, he's in my counseling. Later, when he's 30 years old, he's been married 2 years. His wife's saying to me, Pastor, there's something wrong. My husband has trouble with intimacy. Well, yes, because when he was 18 months old, he was taught that his body is a shameful thing. Are you with me? We think that's crazy, but it's not crazy. It happens all the time. Women especially, cover yourself. It's your fault, right? You teach a young girl who's abused by her uncle that it's her fault because she dressed a certain way? What are you teaching her? That her shame is her fault when it was really caused by the actions of others. These things are crucial. What about fear? Well, in a healthy family, we're taught to avoid truly dangerous or foolish thoughts, words, or actions, right? Truly dangerous. We say to the children, do not run out on the street in front of vehicles. Do not put your hand in the fire. In that regard, we want them appropriately to fear that which is actually dangerous. Right? But unhealthy families, right, have unresolved loss or trauma or abuse, and it shows up as phobias. We don't deal with fears. We don't teach appropriateness. We teach inappropriate responses to trauma. I'll give you an example. You were recently, your vehicle was run into by a heifer. Appropriate. Well, what did you learn from that? Well, I learned that even if I'm taking my time and there's cattle present, I can still have my car injured. So next time, I'm not even going to take my time. I'm going to stop 100 meters short and just assume that a cow's going to run after me. Inappropriate. You must never drive again. Driving's too dangerous. Life's too dangerous, person. You should the vehicle must be sold.
It's demonic.
It's demonic. We need to lay hands on the vehicle. It attracted the heifer. What have you been doing in that vehicle? Is praise music always playing, or maybe you didn't have it on? Well, we do this with children all the time. Johnny goes out to play football. He breaks his leg. The mother says, you will never know. Don't want you ever to be hurt. You must never play football again. Healthy says, next time when you go to play, wrap a bit of cloth around your shin so that if you get kicked, you don't break your leg. Appropriate response to danger, right? Are you with me?
Yes.
So, and churches do this all the time. You want to have a new idea. Oh, I don't know. Whoa, taking a big risk. I don't know. And you're thinking, why is this person so scared all the time every time we want to do something new? You find out, well, because when they were 2 years old, they did something stupid and they were taught, life's too dangerous to take risks. Stay in the hut. Yeah. And now they're 40 years old and they can't do anything new. They live afraid. We know people like this. We cast demons out of them. They don't have a demon. They have a phobia. They were taught to live life afraid. Are you with me? Jesus, deliver our brother. Now, the brother can't be delivered. There's no demon. But inside him, fear is in control. We teased about a fear of spiders, the phobia of spiders. Where did it come from? Well, Abby was taught it. Spiders are too dangerous. You can't deal with spiders. Spiders are in charge. So the solution to spiders is not kill them if they're dangerous, but run from them in desperate fear. And now my wife, who's 64 years old, sees a spider, and what do I hear? Ah! I'm like, what is your problem? I think,
And my daughter, who's 33.
would you stop it with this already? Take your shoe off and kill the spider. And she says, well, if you're in the house, I don't have to do that. I don't have to face my fear. You see? My father always delivered my mother from the fear of spiders, and now I want my husband to do that too.
It
Yeah.
affects marriages.
Pastor,
big time.
you need to solve my fear problem. Why am I afraid? If you were a good pastor, I'd stop being afraid. You see? All right, are you with me? That's just family. What about culture?
Doug, can I say one thing about
Yeah,
family?
yeah, just quit saying, can I say one thing?
Okay.
Just say it. You can't just say one thing. You never just say one thing. I'm teasing you.
My family dealt with shame a lot. And I found out many years later, after experiencing my family trying to cover up shame, my sister had a baby and was not married. And until she got pregnant the second time and then married the man, the father of both, my parents didn't tell me that she'd had a baby at all. She lived far away and they would go visit her. They would never let me go visit, but I didn't know why. And it was because until my niece was 18 months old, they didn't want me to know about the shame.
Yes, right.
And they thought I was 15 years. They thought it was going to affect me. They were afraid.
Yes.
And I found out many years later that my father's mother had divorced her first husband, who was an alcoholic, and married his brother. And that was shameful in their community at the time. He was also an alcoholic and ended up committing suicide when my dad was 12. This all influenced my father about shame. He always felt ashamed that this was his parentage.
Yes.
And so when he had children, and my sister was 7 years older than I, he tried to cover up from the community, from the church, anything that happened in our family that was not praiseworthy. But I got so angry with my parents lying to me, not telling me that I was an aunt. I was happy I was an aunt. I wasn't going to go out and have a baby out of wedlock, but that was their fear. So shame and fear and guilt all kind of made a mess together.
And that
in my family.
The 12-year-old boy whose father commits suicide, the second father after a divorce, has been carrying that shame. Now he's 50 years old, and he cannot deal with his daughter's failure.
Yes, he couldn't forgive.
And it was a mess, right? And what does the church do with those things? Nothing. Just let it be.
It's private.
No one ever helped my father-in-law deal with that deeply, and it's terrible. All right, what about culture? Let's move on to culture. Because not only do families influence, but our culture influences, eh? In a healthy culture appropriate, when dealing with guilt rather, appropriately connects our thoughts, words, and deeds to a thriving community. And requires appropriate amends to make things right so we may live well together. Right? So in a healthy community, when somebody does something wrong or doesn't do what they should have done, right? They say, well, you need to understand, and they teach, see, what you've done or didn't do has an effect on the community, a negative effect. And so our relationships are so important that making amends, going to that person, apologizing, seeking reconciliation, are crucial, not just for you, but also the health of our community. And that our community then lives well. We live a peaceful, remember, God creates order that peace may come. So now peace is in our community. Eh? But a culture, an unhealthy approach of culture is, it connects inappropriate or imagined guilt to the community. Or it requires inappropriate amends to make things right, so that we can be restored to a rigid community. By rigid, I mean graceless. In other words, the community appearing to be well when it is not demands that I deal with my guilt in certain ways so that the graceless community continue to be graceless.
So
Churches,
that would include revenge or
sure. There's a lot of things that happen.
casting out people.
It certainly could. It could say, well, you say, well, wait a minute, I didn't do anything. Doesn't matter. People think you did. So you need. Give you an example. I'll give you a horrible example. 14-year-old girl comes to her mother and says, "Mother, my grandfather, your father, attacked me sexually." And the mother says, in her mind, "Oh my God, if this gets out in a certain way, the family reputation will be destroyed." Young lady, I'm sure you did something to cause your grandfather to behave this way. You must go apologize to your grandfather. Or, this is a real one, exact same thing happened, and I said to the person, they're trying to understand why their 35-year-old daughter was divorcing her husband and sleeping around. And it comes out, well, when she was 14, my father tried to have sex with her. I said, what did you do about that? What do you mean? I said, did you call the police and have your father arrested for rape? Oh, no, I could never do that. He's my father. We just made sure that she was never alone with him again. No. They never even went to they never gave the daughter the truth. The justice. You did nothing. He is guilty. The damage to the community is due to his behavior.
Mm-hmm.
She grew up for the next 21 years, and now she's acting out inappropriately in her sexual life. You think that's a surprise? It's not a surprise at all. What are we going to do, cast the demon of sex out of her? No, she was damaged by the rigidity of the mother's community. The family is rigid. Our family doesn't do things like that. No one must know things like that happen. And you will protect you in future, but this must never be spoken of again. Oh, see how unbelievably unhealthy that is. Well, whole cultures do that.
Oh, yes.
Right? Clans do it. Tribes do it.
Mm-hmm.
Nations do it. How about
But it takes away the particular.
it does take away the particular. The individual's value becomes subsumed in the community's
Yes.
false strength, right? It's too rigid. Rather than recognizing the healthy individual is what makes up the healthy community.
Yes.
So great insight, Percy. So if the individual isn't healthy, then the community isn't, no matter how we appear to be. Churches, there's lots of churches like this. They're all behaving properly. But inside their lives, they're absolutely a wreck. You can tell when you deal with them. They're rigid.
And that's what causes corruption,
Yes.
bribe, all sorts of activities.
And you'll see it in weird places. Like in a family that is very preoccupied with some small issue. It comes up in churches. There's intense anger about some small thing on the edge of the church's life. Why are we so angry
About smoking.
about smoking cigarettes? With all seriousness. Oh! I think to myself, if I'm worried about my church family, I mean, it's not healthy, but for God's sakes, up until 50 years ago, Christians smoked all the time. It was considered a non-issue in the church. What is happening here? I'm thinking, meanwhile, we have adultery, we have witchcraft, we have huge issues, but at least we don't smoke cigarettes. Jesus called it straining at gnats and swallowing camels. That's what unhealthy, when a culture doesn't deal with guilt.